designer with over 16 years, practiced in South Australia, Victoria, and North America. She's currently the strategy leader of the Integrated Design Commission in South Australia. I understand that title is about to be and she works with the government architect. My apologies. In the Department of Memory and Housing, she's also a co-host of the successful Radio Adelaide program, The Plan. Previously, Sharon spent 7 years as a senior associate at HASSELL here in Adelaide. Many of her projects have received recognition, including recent major redevelopment of Adelaide Zoo, including the giant Panda exhibit and entrance precinct, including groundbreaking green roof and water energy. Sharon has taught design and presented at many national and international events, including at the World Architecture Festival in Barcelona in 2010. Growing up in country Victoria, on Holly Farm, Sharon's passion for the environment was entrenched further. At age 16, she was a Rotary Exchange student, and her enthusiasm for travel has continued. She's visited all 7 continents, including fulfilling a lifelong dream of travelling the entire west coast of America, from Chile all the way north to Alaska. Sharon trained at the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology. She's practiced nationally and internationally, including 5 years in Canada. Upon returning to Australia with a partner, they claimed the car in 2005. They bought an old car and drove down Australia until they found a place to unpack, choosing Adelaide as a great place to grow their families. Sharon is passionate about connecting people and opportunities, sustainable ecosystems, and healthy communities. Ladies and gentlemen, may I present Sharon Mackay.
Thank you, Tom, for inviting me along to speak to you today. I feel quite privileged to be here in this lovely facility. This is the first time I've been in this room, so it's quite exciting. I thought I'd put this up here as I went through on the weekend and found some old photographs of mine just to prove that I really was a Rotary Exchange student. I realised when I pulled this out that not many people get the claim to be shorter than Bob Hawke. So that's me on the right there. I went all the way to New Zealand, the Rotary Station at the time had a twin system, so you actually had a buddy, and my New Zealand friend came to stay with our family, and then I went back and stayed with her family in Auckland. And what I think is wonderful about this particular program, even though it's just to New Zealand, everyone says to me, oh, why didn't you go to France or somewhere much more exotic, was that I'm friends with her for life now. I'm friends with her family, and we still keep in touch. And she's a lawyer in Auckland, and we have a great network through that Rotary program. So I'm here to talk to you today about cities and why they're important. I know this is a topic that many of you share an interest in. As Tom mentioned, I work with the government architect, Ben Hewitt. First of all, I want to set the scene about why cities actually are important. Obviously, they're important because we all live in them. That's number one. But we also know that we compete. Our cities compete globally and they compete nationally. I'm sure last week it was exciting to see that we've shot up the ladder, and we're now 5th in the world for the most livable city, according to the Economist Intelligence Unit. It assesses livability. Number 1 is Melbourne. We're up again in the top 5, which is great. My sister-in-law lives in Dhaka, which officially came at the bottom of the whole world. Most importantly, as you also heard about my history, people are now making decisions about where to live, in which city to live in, not based on where they were born, but based on on the city itself, how livable it is. It's easier now with technology to live away from your family. It's easier to make decisions about where you want to place yourself. So successful cities actually rely on those types of rankings and their branding and how we talk about them and how they succeed economically to get people to actually attract more people to come and live in them. Of course, successful cities all thrive economically as well. it's interesting to know that in cities we have, 80%, in Australia anyway, 80% of our GDP is actually generated in cities. We also use 75% of our energy in cities. So not only are cities our economic engine rooms, but they're also where we consume an enormous amount of energy. So we have to think about the futures of the city and how we reduce, not increase, our energy use over time. And of course there's some consequences that we have to consider when we think about the future of cities as well. Treasury put a forecast on the cost of traffic congestion at $20 billion by 2020. It's currently sitting around $9.4 billion today. But when you think about it in terms of how much money we spend on health and other services and education, I'd certainly, in this context, I think I'd rather not be paying for congestion issues and rather be paying for education and the well-being of its residents. Interestingly, in Adelaide, in the context of Adelaide specifically, we have a huge number of people who are either at retirement age or getting there anyway over 65. And it's important that we think about not just transport, but also mobility. It's a really important thing to think about. Another statistic that I came across when I was preparing this was I was quite interested. I was on a website called Fight Dementia, and I hadn't realised up until then that by 2050 there's going to be an increase by 350% in cases in dementia. And what's interesting about that is they also said that 50% of those cases are actually preventable. And it's preventable through a whole different lens of things, but well-being and the way that we live is very much a part of that. And again, in terms of health costs and congestion costs, I think I'd certainly be putting my money towards more research into curing dementia than I would be into congestion. So another, I guess the way to think about it, and I don't want to scare anyone, but Treasury in 2009 also forecast our population increase. 36 million people in Australia by 2050. So we're about 23 million now. So in the last 175 years, we built Greater Adelaide, we built one of them. In the next few years, we're going to have to build not 1, 2, 3, but we're actually going to have to build 16 more Greater Adelaides, but in a very, very short period of time. So we actually do have the opportunity to design our city. We've got to design it very fast, and we've got to think about what we want from our cities when we start thinking about the future. Of course, cities the way they originally came about was really around commerce, and it was around being able to walk places and being able to use horse and cart and mercantile features and those sorts of things. But it's had some unintended consequences, I would suggest, that maybe we weren't thinking about so easily. Post-war, of course, we had some changes. We had the suburban dream, and I think I'm not here to suggest that there's anything wrong with suburbia. I live in it, and there's certainly not wrong with anyone that lives in suburbia. But I think it's important to think about those unintended consequences of what came with suburbia. The suburban dream came with the idea of, and this is certainly what my parents had and what my grandparents had, came with the backyard, came with being able to ride your bike on the street. You knew your neighbours, you could grow your vegetables in the backyard. But as that sustainable model of suburbia has disappeared over time, unfortunately we lead busy lives. What comes with suburbia also comes traffic. So we spend a lot more time in our car. It has environmental consequences. We recognise now that, interestingly, Australia has the largest house size in the world. I'll just find out what it is actually, because I've got it written down here, and again I thought this was quite spectacular, that Greece has a house size of around 127 square metres per household. Once you get up to Denmark, you're sitting about 136 square metres per household. Australia, we have an average size of 227 square metres. And what's interesting about that is not the house size, but that in the last 30 years it increased by 40%, which is enormous. So what's happened is our house sizes have remained the same, but our block sizes have started to come down. So all those benefits of suburbia that we saw, which was the rain falls into a backyard and it's able to go into the soil and enrich our environment and not clog up our water systems. The ability to grow food in your backyard's disappearing until I suggest that we probably might start seeing in the future an actual reduction in our house size as well. So I just also wanted to again, not going into scare tactics here, but I wanted to bring up just a particular case study that we've been looking at, which is very interesting. Curtin University has just released some research that has looked into the increase in asthma in young children that go to school or live near major arterials and roadways. Now, what I think is really interesting about this one is that today we're dealing with much more complex systems and complex issues than maybe we were 30 years ago when the suburban dream occurred post-Second World War. Issues like this, I think, is challenging because we don't have a governance model that actually addresses that issue all at once. We have linear and vertical governance systems. So when you think about something, an issue like children getting asthma because they live near roads, you'd think, well, it's probably the problem of the education department. You know, please don't build schools near roads. It's also probably a bit of a problem for the health department because they're dealing with the consequences of increased asthma. But originally, it's also where it originates from, probably also a bit of a problem for the transport department because they also need to think about, you know, congestion issues adjacent to schools. But then when you think about it in the other way, vertically, we'll think about who owns the responsibility also for the road itself. You've got federal government that is usually in charge of the roadways, most of the roads. You've got state government that's usually in charge of the transport, local buses and a light system. And then you've got local councils that are usually responsible for the street trees, which can mitigate a lot of those issues and help suck up some of the CO2. So our system at the moment isn't really able to cope with those really complex systems unless we change the way we think about cities, and more importantly, if we change the way that we work together to deliver those cities. Which brings me to 5,000 plus. Now, no one's heard of this in the last 12 or 18 months. I would invite you to go and have a look at the website because over the last 12 months we've had 179,000 interactions with the website of people coming and talking to us about what they want for the future of their city. And the premise of the project really is that the design of the future of our city is actually something that we can talk about now and something that we can all be actively involved in. It's not about chance. There's some things that are obviously input into that, like time and climate change, but it's up to us to actually think about this increase in urban populations. And it's up to us right now to make some of those changes. And it's really important that we actually set our vision for what we want, what we want for our families and what we want for ourselves, rather than actually just getting the rules first. We want it to be the other way around, that the rules follow that vision that we're trying to achieve. So again, it points to some rapid changes that we need to make about the vision and the rules as well. So I'm sure you all know this, but I'm going to remind us of who actually makes cities in the first place. It's complex. Politicians make cities. Politicians with visions make cities. People who have in bureaucracy make cities. They're very important to help set a vision and set an agenda. We certainly know that developers, entrepreneurs, business people, they set the economic wheels turning and keep us going and being economically viable, and it's important. And most of those people are actually advocates for cities because that's where they do their business. It also relies a little bit on, oddly enough, on the people that have dissent around cities. It's really important that we have a really good discourse about what we want. So it's often the communities, this is my own community in Henley Beach, that are really frustrated at the moment about a development that's occurring there. And it's that fear that actually creates a conversation that's a good thing to have. I know we're having it about heights and density at the moment in the city of Adelaide as well. It is important that this group exists because they help us mould what those values are. And I also think that it's up to the people who are just the doers, the ones that can't wait for the 4-year electrical cycle, or the ones that just want to get out there and do it. In that same community, Henley Beach, where they're having the problem with development, we're also this weekend planning our community garden and just getting on with it, not really waiting for the longer longer cycles to occur. But what it is, it's actually all these people. You need all these people involved in making cities. If one of those people aren't at the table when you're talking about cities, you're always missing something. There's going to be a gap in how you deliver something and successfully. And of course, as I mentioned before, we've got some other things that come into the play, like time. You've got, as I said, short-term electoral cycles. In fact, the longest time, but possibly the most dramatic one at the moment, is climate change and what an effect that's having on us. Another little interesting story, again, something that we all probably know about Adelaide, but is just being discovered by a wonderful researcher and landscape architect called Graham Hopkins, who's put a whole series of probes across the city of Adelaide and has started to determine where our urban heat island bubble actually sits. As you may know, cities create, they're called urban heat islands, the bubbles of CO2, and they increase the air temperature, which has obvious consequences on our health and well-being. We know in Adelaide it occurs over the CBD, over the business district. We also know that in summer there's an afternoon breeze that comes down from the hills in the gully, and by 4 o'clock in the afternoon it shifts that heat island, that heat bubble, just across into the western parklands and where the new hospital's being built. So for those of us that are designing services for new hospitals, they have to actually double or up the services of the air conditioning units at the hospital, because it's actually having the consequence of our urban heat island. So some of that research around our climates are actually helping us to shape the city. Where should we put things? How should we mitigate it? How should we treat our parklands better to help mitigate issues like that? So 5,000 Plus started a couple of years ago, but we've just got into the last 12 months and it's coming to the end of the project at the moment. What's interesting about the project is it brings together all the people involved in making cities. It's a project of 3 levels of government, which rarely happens. Usually you see 2 levels of government come together, but not all 3. So we're working with the 7 inner ring councils, Adelaide City Council, across 4 state government departments and the major cities unit in the federal government. It also brings together a huge amount of conversation partners, so the PCA and industry bodies and institutes of architects and Bike SA and all the people that are involved in having influence from that top down to bottom up in our city have joined us on the journey. And essentially what it's trying to do is flip the current status quo on its head, where the announce and defend model, where everything's done behind doors, we make decisions in government without consulting to the community in the early stages, we get it right, it's very risk adverse, we make sure it's right before we go and tell people about it. Has an obvious risk of once you get to the community, like at Henley Beach, everyone says, well, hold on, that's not exactly what I wanted for my neighbourhood. So back you go to the start again. So it's trying to flip that on its head, where it says, first of all, what we need to do is establish partnerships and talk early with the community and talk early with people who are going to be involved in whatever it might be that you're trying to achieve. To actually start to understand that you might actually identify better things to do or ways to do it differently, or advocates for what you're doing and champions early on in the process. I must say that that's probably been the hardest part of the project, because obviously that's pretty impossible. And we're pushing against a system that's set up to be the other way around. We really are a risk-adverse group for obvious reasons, for your electoral cycles being part of that. So we've had some wins in that area, but we're still working on it. Part of that, the project has modelled that particular process, and we've been doing a whole number of different things, and I'll go through exactly what they are. As I mentioned, we've had 179,000 interactions with the website. The purpose is really about looking at long-term issues and then coming up with short-term tactics to deliver it. We had a series of forums. These forums were absolutely wonderful and certainly the highlight of the project for me, because we invited about 500 experts in the city to come in and have a real conversation. Not just come and put your idea on the table and then walk away and go back to your job, but actually bring to the table your technical expertise, but then have a conversation and see if there's any ways to innovate. No one had an innovative idea. Steve Jobs didn't. No one did just by themselves in a room in the back shed. It's actually about talking to each other and trying to understand what the hurdles are and then trying to unlock it between you. The first outcome of the project was a vision for Adelaide and a series of guiding principles, and I'm not going to go through these individually because I won't have time. These are not too similar to what you'd see in any other city, really, across humanity. We really kind of want the same things. But these are very specific to Adelaide, so they took the specific challenges that we have in Adelaide. So you can't actually apply the same principles to Melbourne or Sydney, but they're quite similar to what you see elsewhere. And then purposely used imagery that would place us way out in the future so that we can start working towards it, not back from it. And the second part of it is the strategy itself. So that's how do we move forward in Adelaide? What do we want based on everyone that we talk to? What's the common values that everyone's sharing? And then what's the method and process that we have to employ to actually get there? That's currently sitting in Cabinet, and hopefully in about a week's time I'll be able to talk to people a bit more specifically about what those actual recommendations are. Again, the recommendations that have come from everybody involved in the process. And also what comes out of the project is we learn whole new ways of doing things. And pretty much everyone in the project agreed that there were some great new ideas about how you can prototype ideas around the city. There were some really great initiatives that have been around how governments can engage with the community better. So if it was an act in 4 parts, research was a very important part of what we did at the start of the project. We spent about 12 months of researching and really pulling together all the understanding. Research around Adelaide sits in all these different departments and everyone knows something different, but we tried to bring it all together to really understand what it was that makes Adelaide tick. Those documents are all available on our website, which has been enormously beneficial to other government departments and people operating in the city to get that information. We've been working with ABS to understand what exactly it even is that we measure in Adelaide. Do we even know who lives in the inner city? Do we understand how we currently measure our census data to actually start understanding what actually is livability? What does it mean? Hands up if someone doesn't really want to live in a livable city. I do. I think livability is actually a pretty low standard in terms of cities I'd like to live there. I'd suggest that Dhaka in Bangladesh is even livable. It's actually how you measure what's important about being livable that counts. So we've been working to try and recalibrate how we even measure the impacts of the city. And then the second part I've already sort of mentioned was these forums. That was the asking period, and we asked the community as well. We asked small focus groups, big groups, all sorts of different people how to get the answers that we were seeking. And some of those things are now being seen in areas like Lee Street and Bank Street, where they're now closing it down to traffic, which is what people told us through the process. And I just want to flick, because I know I don't have much time, I just want to flick to some of the design testing we did, because I think it's really important. I just want to use this particular example before I get kicked off stage by Tom. This project was part of the design testing we did called Patterns of Living. We went down to the West Torrens community and we started talking to them about this really serious problem that we have around ageing in place and how we could possibly look at mitigating it. So we know that living in an aged care facility costs the government around about $50,000, costs us about $50,000 per annum. We know that ageing in place costs us about $11,000. So there's obviously a really significant impact, and it's important that we actually get people to age in place, apart from the social benefits of ageing in place, of course, and going back to the possibility of multi-generational living. It helps someone like me that's got a 3-year-old if I had a grandparent here. And what we looked at was the areas like Unley, where we've been told hands-off. It's a heritage area. We've got street trees. We've got lovely heritage, beautiful stone buildings in Adelaide. And everyone said, no way, that is not negotiable. So we heard that, we listened to it, and we said, but how do we get more people living on those blocks? So what we started to look at was what happens if you just tweak the laneways. The laneways we don't use for servicing of our rubbish anymore anyway. We put our big bins on the street. So what happens if you actually have a dwelling on top of the double garage at the back? It's only a minor tweak to our, well, quite a big one, but it seems like a minor tweak to our planning laws to enable that to happen. And then what happens when you actually, sorry, here was the slide I was looking for about cost. What happens if you actually start then sharing that laneway? So someone may be using their backyard for growing vegetables, someone else might be using it for multi-dwelling units. How can we actually keep the fabric family that we really care about, but how can we also start to densify those areas and get more opportunities in the laneways? And obviously the benefit of that, is changing our laneways from this, which I would say in Unleague isn't so attractive, to something where you actually start getting a community where you've got passive surveillance, so the kids can start to ride their trikes in the back lane again, and goodness knows what can pop up in laneways of Unleague. So that project we then took down to the community in Unleague and started talking to them about it. The conversation about density just went out the window, because what they were really interested in was what's going to attract me to move into the city or move closer, or what's going to attract me to be able to stay in place but make my wellbeing and life better. And so it was quite extraordinary that the people that we spoke to really thought that maybe this was a great idea, because it just gave them another option. It's not all about living in 30-storey, high-density, 2-bedroom apartments in the city. It's actually about getting more people to have better lives, less use of their cars, more opportunities to live well, more where they want to go, look after their grandkids and have a better life. So I'm just going to finish up with this, which has become our mantra as we now move into the last phase of the project, which is actually getting these recommendations out to everybody and starting to get some of these implemented, and particularly talking to all those groups of people again, that we have a vision now. We pretty much understand, again, with all those people that have been put into the city, into the conversation, we understand what people want. What we're trying to do now is keep that vision firm and fast as we start making the rules and implementing the day-to-day things that occur underneath it. So I encourage you to watch this space. I don't think wholesale is going to be some miraculous thing that happens in Adelaide, but we've still got 4 more steps to go in that livability index till we knock Melbourne off the top. So I'm very excited about being in Adelaide to watch us still go up. Thanks.
Thank you, Sharon, for that most interesting presentation. Mr. President, we've got time for a question. We've got time for one question.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Sharon. I guess my question's in 2 parts. I do wonder how Melbourne got the top ranking. I think for those of us who live there, we query that. Secondly, there was a recent feature in one of the summaries of news items and so on, and I understand why we're focusing on cities, but there is an underlying concern. We're becoming very city-centric, and South Australia is probably the worst example, in that we're so focused on the city, we're forgetting the rest of the state, and despite all our attention to things like mining booms and this, that and every other thing, the fact is that it's still agriculture that returns a dependable sort of component of our GDP year in, year out, and yet it's depopulating at a rapid rate. Is there any kind of consideration of what we're going to do about some of our regional centres to keep them as viable parts of those communities?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. 5,000 plus, that particular project I talked about, was very much about the inner region and the CBD itself. So that project didn't necessarily talk to the regions. The process of that project could be applied in any region. It could be applied in Mount Gambier or an entire Eyre Peninsula if you wanted to. It's the process that we've been piloting and looking at. In terms of the regions, though, and what happens, I think there's a lot of debate over it. We haven't quite come to a happy medium about what happens to regions. They're enormously important for the obvious reasons that you've talked about. They're also important to South Australia because that's where a lot of our branding is associated to, the Barossa Valley and Kangaroo Island and that sort of thing. So it's certainly a very important part of it. But I think if you think back to where we're headed, is also important to consider that there is already issues and there's a need for environmental and social reasons to make sure that the conditions for people to move to the city, if they choose to, are right. We know that no one is going to move into the city to live in a 2-bedroom apartment in a 30-storey building because there's a 30-storey building there. They'll move there because there's great opportunities in the city for work, for play, for recreation, for all those other reasons and social well-being. And that all happens at the ground plane. And it's not necessarily about the built environment that provides that. So I think there's probably a balance between the two, but we really have to focus on the city at the moment, get the conditions right, and then look at the regions as well at the same time.
Sharon, thank you very much. And I think the overall importance is that it's great that the Premier's Department and the government are taking such a great interest in design. Sharon, thank you.